Well, before we kick off this episode, I got to tell you, Nature Bee have come up with something dangerous. Their new Power Bee Bite Bars. Chocolate caramel or peanut honey choc chip. They taste so good, you're going to forget they're healthy. Packed with protein, boosted with power pollen, they're perfect for the road, perfect for the shed, perfect for the man cave, perfect anytime you need a quick lift. And they're paired beautifully with your daily power pollen capsules to create the ultimate wellness routine. Links are in the description right now, but stick around, I'll tell you more.
Luke's on the desk, pushing wrong bloody knobs. Blames the glitch bitch instead of doing his job. Kels rolls her eyes, says, mate, just shut up. She runs this whole circus while he drinks from his cup. We're gonna fight and busted, but you legends stick around. Luke's chilly meltdowns and his bulletproof head sound. Rod's yelling about green reflectors, Bill's digging up the dead. And thank fuck for this mad mob who listen instead.
Now, this one is a cracker. You're about to hear my very first chat with Keith Banks. Now, he's a bloke who spent years undercover in the Queensland Police Force back in the bad old days. We're talking about drug busts, shotguns under the table, double lives, mateship that only comes when you're living on the edge. Fascinating character, Keith Banks. And he doesn't sugarcoat it either. He opens up about the booze culture, the mental toll, and what it was like staring down a shotgun barrel one minute and having a detective's 38 shoved in your mouth the next. It's unbelievable. It's raw, it's wild, and it's the sort of conversation that makes you shake your head at what these undercover coppers went through back in the day. So let's unwind the clock. Here's my chat with Keith Banks. So finally we meet Keith Banks. Welcome to the Bonafide podcast with me, Luke Boner. Lovely to meet you. I feel as though I know you very, very well.
Good morning, Luke. And mate, really appreciate the opportunity and invitation. So yeah, great to chat and thank you.
I have, through the course of my career, spoken to many policemen. Mark Ainsworth has already been on this podcast.
Yep, I know Mark.
You're a fascinating character.
Yeah.
Also, I have a neighbour who is retired detective who was around the Roger Rogerson era. He was based at King's Cross in the late 70s. He's retired and he is suffering unbelievable PTSD. He finds it very hard to relate and lead a normal life, even though he's retired. The amount of help that was on tap back in those days was non-existent. Yep. And he told me over a couple of beers one day that police officers didn't have the support that they deserved and saw terrible, terrible things. And so what they did was they congregated together, formed their own club, and often that involved consuming a lot of alcohol, which wasn't healthy.
Copious amounts of alcohol, mate. And, as you know, Luke, I'm a passionate advocate for the mental health conversation. Back in the day, the culture of policing was that we were all apparently tough guys. You had to be tough. If you showed any weakness in that organisation, I won't say you were shunned, but you certainly wouldn't be accepted as readily as if you were the strong type. That all makes sense. So from a traumatic perspective, and cops see things, and it was the same then. It's been the same back in the days of the Roman centurions, I suppose. But and it's still the same now. Police see things that normal people don't. And they see the inhumanity of man to man, and there are some dark things that people do to each other. So that all builds, that trauma experience builds and builds. And the way that we, and I was one of them, used to cope with it in the old days was just to get hammered. And there was an old saying, we didn't drink to be social, we drank for effect. And that then created its own problems and its own cultural issues, its own mental health challenges as well. And, one of the big things that police probably don't do now, and I'm not suggesting the alcohol was the right thing to do, but I think what they don't do now is they don't take the time to decompress with each other before they go home. It's almost, you sign your firearm and do whatever you got to do, get changed out of your uniform and you're in your car and gone. So, I think that's a gap.
And not wanting to appear weak.
Yeah. That's still part of it. Yep. It's getting better. The culture is changing. I think it's just a natural consequence of younger generations coming into a job that's still pretty tough. And I think, people from a younger generation now, because our daughters are 29 and 27, and they are more open emotionally and they are more vulnerable, and they choose that than we ever were. So, maybe that's an incremental change, one would hope.
But when you talk about the age of your children and you think about, you entered the police force in 1975, but I think you were about 22 when you went undercover. And I know that you talk a lot about 3 tiers of policing. One is obviously being in uniform, addressing an issue, going to a house, making an arrest, or detectives doing the background work, getting people before a court, getting all the accolades when they get a conviction. But then there's undercover policing, which is another thing altogether. And you talk about the lack of welfare for police officers. I think there's maybe not so much today, but a lack of welfare for anyone that's a first responder, for example. Imagine what paramedics and fireys have to go through on a day-to-day basis. But I want to talk about your incredible books and your incredible life. And you talk about consuming copious amounts of alcohol. You were a fitness fanatic, a martial arts expert, I think a first dan in karate, and very, very fit, very aware of health issues. And next thing you know, on one occasion, you were to help get a conviction and to help gain the trust of a dealer, you were forced to do a line of speed.
Yep.
You had to do it to keep your cover. That must have been amazing.
Well, also the fact, Luke, that there was a double-barreled shotgun pointed at me across the table, and the.
So tell us this story.
Well, I guess go back a step. Yeah, you're right. I trained a lot in those days, and I joined the academy the year I turned 17. So I was a schoolboy. Essentially, I did year 12 in the academy and another 12 months of training after that under the cadetship. Doesn't exist anymore. So then I was sworn in. I was from the country. I was incredibly naive. I was never exposed to the drug scene. I didn't drink, never smoked a cigarette, etc. And I trained in Taekwondo, actually. Started karate in the academy, switched Taekwondo. It's a martial art thing. And I was training. I actually did my first band black belt when I was still undercover. And the people I trained with, I had told that I'd been fired from the police force for drug issues. So I'd lied to them, for the entire time I was undercover.
Yeah.
And I trained with them while I was in Brisbane, in between operations that often sent us outside. And we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But on this particular occasion, I was doing an operation in Brisbane. It was one of the first ones I had done, so I was still learning as I went along. And in those days, it's not like the movies, there was no backup following me. I wasn't wearing a listening device. And just like the other 3 or 4 undercover guys, and we're all men, there were no women in those days. We were simply living in a world with no support. So sometimes we were carrying a gun, sometimes we weren't. And we just went out and scored drugs, then recorded all of that, brought the evidence back at the right time, and people would be arrested. So in this occasion, I was at the then infamous Royal Exchange Hotel in Brisbane, which is now a lot more sedate, one would hope. And it was pretty much a drug mecca. So I met a guy, as you do, in a pub, and we arranged for me to buy some speed from him. And I was buying from a lot of people. So I didn't see this as anything out of the ordinary. And we arranged to meet at a little place he had in Auchenflower in Brisbane. In those days, a bit squalid. These days, multi-million-dollar property.
Yeah, it's very upmarket now.
Yeah. And in hindsight, gee, I wish I'd only bought sort of houses for $5,000 in those days. Anyway, so I went and knocked on the door. It's got to picture it. Yeah, never used drugs in my life. I'd started smoking a little bit of weed with targets when I had to. And even that was, for me, difficult to reconcile with my fitness approach. But I just decided, hey, I've got to do it. I've got to do it. So Went inside, said, yeah, we met today, the usual story. Here's the money. I want a couple of bags as a sample. And he said, sure, we'll do a line. And I just rolled out my usual excuse, which was, I don't use the shit. I'm in it for the money.
To me, it's a business. I don't touch it.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, and I continued with that all through my undercover career. Unfortunately, as you've read, a friend of mine started using heroin and had developed an addiction, and his life went badly.
Is this Harry Shehab?
Harry Shehab, yeah. Harry's real name. When I wrote, just a sidetrack, when I wrote the book, I rang Harry, or I contacted him. I re-established contact with him through the death of a friend of ours. And I said, look, mate, I've written our story. Finally, I'm changing your name, but I just want to let you know I'm writing about what happened to you. And his immediate response was, use my name, mate. Use my name. Everyone in my network knows it. I've reinvented myself, and, you know, et cetera. So at any rate, sitting there, back to the dealer, sitting there at the table, and I rolled out the usual, don't use the shit a minute for the money. And he produced a double-barrel sawn-off shotgun.
Wow.
From under the table, and put it on the table and cocked both hammers.
Sawn off. Yeah,
commonly called a coach gun in police parlance and underworld parlance. And I stood, and let me tell you, when you look down the wrong end of one of those things, they look like a howitzer.
Wow.
And he said, either you do a line with me or I'll shoot you. His exact words were, blow your chest out or blow your guts out or something. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, you know, I've got no support, no backup. I'm all alone. So I just looked at him and said, okay, you got a straw. So, so I snorted speed off this. I'd never used it in my life. Snorted speed off this filthy, bloody, I don't know, plastic table. Then gave him the money, did the transaction, left. And then I was driving back to where I was living and just speeding off my nut and thinking, Jesus Christ, you know, what's happening to me? I hope I'm not going to die.
Yeah.
All of that stuff that would run through your mind as a young guy who's never been involved in the same.
Wow. And of course, that's not the only time you had a gun pointed at you. You actually had a detective put a gun in your mouth.
Yeah.
Tell us this story.
Well, we were, it was after the operation where I did the speed, and it was the first operation that I was sent to outside the metro area. So I guess to give it some context, mate, there were no training courses in those days.
Right.
You were simply...
You were just thrown in.
You were thrown in, yeah. I volunteered for it. I thought it was a noble thing to do, and I wanted to change the world. I wanted to do something to fight the heroin trade. And I have to be honest, you know, part of the motivation was having come from 2 years in the academy and then almost 3 years on the road in uniform, where you had haircut regulations and, you know, all sorts of things. The concept of working undercover and being able to dress how I liked, wear my hair how I liked, grow a beard, grow a foot and earring, and all of that stuff, as a 22-year-old kid was pretty attractive. So, you know, I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. So we're sent to Townsville on an operation. And in those days, we used our own cars and claimed mileage, and, you know, it was pretty Wild West. And I think about 3 hours outside Townsville on the Pacific Highway, I hit a pothole and blew a shock absorber. So, and on this occasion, I had a colleague with me, an undercover colleague. So anyway, drove in, dropped the car off after we'd cleaned it out, or so I thought, because we had a few guns. We had a shotgun each, I think, from memory, because in those days, everybody had guns. For all those young listeners, long before the firearms regulations were tightened, you could walk into a Kmart, and you could buy a pump-action shotgun or a 223 semi-automatic rifle with 30 rounds.
High-powered rifle?
High-powered rifles, yeah. So I thought I'd cleaned everything out, and I inadvertently left a box of 38 hollow point ammunition under the spare wheel.
Oh.
And anyway, I went to pick the car up after it had been repaired, and John and I looked like pretty bad guys. You know, I'd grown a big black beard, and I had my hair down to my shoulders by that stage, almost to my shoulders. And again, to put it in context, in the 80s, police weren't allowed to grow beards. You had to have a medical certificate, etc. So, and pretty much everybody, and you'd remember, Luke, from those days, pretty much everybody had beards or goatees or long hair. And, you know, if you looked that way, you certainly weren't a cop, or you weren't in the armed services.
Possibly a porn star, but...
If you look on my website, I've got an embarrassing photograph, or in my book.
I've seen it.
With a big mustache.
But please keep going. So the car's gone in for a service, and you've left a box of ammo in the back under the spare wheel.
Yeah, and I found out later that the guy who owned the garage was actually worked not with the police, but certainly gave them information. He was very friendly with the police. So he contacted them to say that there were a couple of desperados that had dropped off a car, and there was a box of ammunition, revolver ammunition or pistol ammunition. So he contacted them, and there'd been a death threat against a detective. So all of the perfect storm, and the detectives put two and two together and got five and thought that we were hitmen. So John and I had a unit or a flat. Well, I call it a unit, I suppose, in West Townsville. So I was on the balcony looking out, contemplating the world. And I saw three CIB cars, so obvious police cars in those days, pull up in front of the driveway. And I said to John, Jesus, the Ds are here, the Jacks are here. And I said, wow, there's getting out of the car and they've got guns in their hands. Something must be on. And then I said, Jesus, they're running up here. So then they bashed on the door and I went to open it, and the first detective pushed me against the wall and put his 38 in my mouth.
Jesus.
And I remember thinking, when stuff goes badly, I thought, I saw where his finger was. It was on the trigger, and I thought, I hope his firearm skills are up to, or his trigger discipline is up to scratch. So, and then, as we put it politely in the old days, he interviewed me soundly around the head and shoulders. In other words, he gave me a bit of a smack, as you would, and demanded the keys to the car, etc. And that's when my colleague was in another room being soundly interviewed by another detective.
Vigorously interviewed.
Vigorously interviewed, yeah. And that's when he said, that's enough, we're drug squad. And then the usual response was, that's bullshit. So, there was only one person in Townsville who knew we were there, and that was the detective senior sergeant. So then a couple of phone calls were made. Then they removed us from the unit, and they took us out, not in handcuffs. You didn't handcuff everyone in those days, but they certainly dragged us out to the cars to have everybody who was looking on, feel that we were baddies and that we were being dragged away, which became beneficial later.
Yeah, it helped with your undercover persona.
Sure. I would rather it hadn't developed that way. But Ferret, that was his nickname, the detective, and I became very, very good friends, and we're still very good friends now, and we used to laugh about it when he was transferred back to Brisbane.
So just going back a bit, so you're 22 and you have been a police officer for a while.
About 3 years, yeah.
3 years. And you can wear what you want. You can look like what you want. Your hours, you probably get up at 11 o'clock in the morning. And
in time to watch the, I think it was the 11 a.m. Was it 11 a.m.
11 a.m.
Days, the news?
11 a.m. on Channel 7.
Yeah, that's the one.
And then, of course, your real work was probably done after dark in pubs and beer gardens.
Yeah, it depended. Yeah, sometimes during the day, often during the day. And the old story, mate, the pub is where you'll make a lot of contacts for everything from buying a gun to stolen property to drugs to anything really.
Roger Rogerson, for all his faults, I mean, he was the crooked cop that we often talk about. But he actually said something that was true, and that was, if you want to infiltrate the Crims, you've got to be one. You've got to befriend them so that you know what's going on. And I know that you say that being an undercover copper, just bearing in mind, folks, he's 22. He's got kids who are 27 now. You're 22. The adrenaline, it must have been something that you could get hooked on. But the other thing is you have got to be an Academy Award-winning actor. And I know that you say if an actor gets a bad review, their feelings are a bit hurt. You get a bad review and you could cop a baseball bat across your head.
Precisely right. Yeah, that's a favourite saying I've been using for a long time to try and explain to people what the world was like. And you're right, you have to. So my great friend Larry, who was another undercover colleague, he used to say it was like NIDA on steroids.
NIDA on steroids.
NIDA on steroids, yeah. And some crooks were convinced that undercovers had gone through NIDA, and because we were such good actors. And there's a couple of things you've touched on, mate. And one is the adrenaline. Absolutely. The rush is like nothing else. So another great friend of mine, Chuck, who featured in a documentary that Channel 9 did on me a little while ago. Chuck said the best descriptor he's ever used for undercover is think about the most scared you've ever been in your life. Whether it's being I don't know, jumping out of an airplane to do skydiving or a massive roller coaster or swimming with the sharks. The most scared you've ever been, now do that 3 times a week for 2 years. That's what working undercover is like. And it is bloody frightening, particularly in those days with, as I say, no backup, to spend your time in bikie clubhouses or, drug dealers' houses or pubs surrounded by the enemy. But it's also very addictive.
Yes, I can imagine.
And that's the paradox.
I can imagine.
That's the paradox.
But you must have also had some fights with your conscience, because you talk about, you just said, you're surrounded by the bad guys, but some of those bad guys were quite likable.
Yeah.
And there's someone that you probably go and have a beer with, and then ultimately you are going to betray them. That's
exactly right. That's the thing about working undercover, and every single undercover I've ever spoken to, and I include ex-undercovers from around Australia, New Zealand, and a couple in the USA, and one in particular who was ex-Scotland Yard, who I worked with in my corporate career later. Every single undercover says that's the most challenging part, is that you're making human connection, knowing full well that you will betray them at some point in that relationship. And a lot of operators don't lose touch with reality, but the lines blur very, very much. And in those days, if you think back to the corrupt era of the Queensland Police, and I'll qualify that by saying the vast majority of men and women I knew were totally honest and straight people, but there was a cohort of corruption in Queensland in those days. The commissioner went to jail for corruption after a royal commission, so that indicates to listeners what it was like. And dealing or mixing with drug dealers, some of whom I did quite like. And then there were some detectives in the drug area who were clearly corrupt, manipulative, people. I found myself preferring the company of some drug dealers to that of some police. So then you combine all of that, walking on eggshells, hypervigilance, being careful who we spoke to within the police force, and then working undercover, portraying yourself as a drug dealer in that transactional world and forming relationships. I used to think that I'd walked away after 2 years of undercover pretty much unscathed, but it's only later in life when I've analysed it, it changed me in many ways. Some for the better, some for the worse.
We're going to get to that really important point a little bit later about PTSD, because back in the day it didn't exist. What you did was you had to gather with your friends and just drink to try and mask all that pain, and there was also that camaraderie, because you're doing it with people who know exactly what you're going through. What about uncovering dirty cops?
Yeah, I've written pretty openly about a couple of those. I was never working in the internal affairs area. I came across some things, and I remember I spoke with a detective sergeant who I could trust, and something had happened, and I was out having a beer with him and said, "Look, mate, I need to do something about this." This is after I'd left undercover. And he said, "All right, you can go to internal investigations, but you're not going to be completely 100% aware of who you're talking to and who they know. If it goes badly," he used much more Anglo-Saxon language than this, but if it goes badly, you could come home and potentially find the garage of your unit full of stolen TVs or half an ounce of heroin in your bedside drawer. And you will come home and people will be waiting with a search warrant, and then you are stuffed.
Yes. Or even worse, if you are a copper that turns whistleblower, you could end up being shot like Michael Drury was by Christopher Dale Flannery, Mr. Rent-A-Kill, because he was about to blow the whistle on Roger Rogerson and other police corruption in Melbourne, and he was shot.
Yeah, I knew Mick actually. I met him before he was shot. Yeah,
shot through his kitchen window at his house in Chatswood.
Yeah, well, he was feeding his little girl. And that's Jesus, that whole world of Sydney it made the corruption in Queensland look like kindergarten children, and then the corruption in Queensland was bad enough. And you're right, it was, if you'd blown the whistle on corruption in those days, it was, as an undercover cop, quite possible that your identity would be quickly disclosed to the bad guys, and that way the bad guys could do the job of a corrupt detective. Yeah. So we walked a really fine line, and I've used the analogy often that it's like water finding its own level.
Yeah.
We found other honest police that we could trust.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we avoided as best we could those we couldn't trust.
But the ones that you couldn't trust were probably great actors as well, and you probably didn't know.
Oh no, we knew. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we could tell, you could tell by some observations. You could also, Larry and I think it's in my first book. I'm pretty sure it's in the first book where I wrote about Larry and I had finished an undercover job in North Queensland. And we had a police club in those days, which was a licensed bar that only cops or people who were signed in could get into. And we shouldn't have done it, but we went up there to have a few beers. We just wanted to be surrounded by normal cops again, I think. And we were sitting there having a couple of beers, more than a couple, having a few by ourselves. And we were approached by some detectives who came over and surrounded us. And we thought initially it was, good job, boys, how you doing? And very, very quickly the conversation was, listen, you two, next time you're in the field, we've got a lot of heroin and we want you two to move it and we'll split the profits 50-50. And that was when I looked at Larry and he looked at me, and I remember thinking, I just have lost so much faith in my naive belief that everyone was doing this job for the same reasons we were. And I talked my way out of it and, just said, oh, look, it's too risky or something. And they didn't really have much to do with us after that. But the very fact that they were so open and blasé about having a conversation about selling heroin.
But they could have been testing you.
Well, no. These guys were, there were some other things they'd been up to. So
you talk about how you started as an idealist and you ended up being a massive cynic. Was that the beginning of that?
Oh, it probably was one of the major factors, I guess. Cynicism and the whole jaded approach comes with most cops, I think, Luke. I think you're so disappointed by humans. You're so disappointed by what people can do to each other, how much they can turn on each other. And in the police culture as well, I saw, particularly later in my career, a bit of a tall poppy syndrome, and if you didn't fit a template, then I won't say you're ostracized, but you were sort of, pushed to one side or judged or whatever by those who, and the template I mean, the short sleeve, bad tie, drinking detective attitude that was prevalent amongst a lot of people, not all of them. There were some bloody good detectives and good operators, but just that little cohort. Yeah. And so I was disappointed by that. I was, just witnessing the world, I suppose, mate. And I think the best descriptor would be just world weary. That's why a lot of cops do tend to associate with only other cops because they get each other.
Yep.
And it's a trap. That contributes to mental health issues and emotional issues. There's a moral injury as well. There's a whole conversation around that.
You talk about the dangers of losing your anonymity and having your cover blown. There's a story, and I'd love you to tell it if you could. My understanding, tell me if I've got this wrong, you're probably in a beer garden again or at a bar, and you're trying to convince the people you're meeting that you're a crook as well. And the guy pouring your beer recognised you from school, even though you had the long hair and the mo. Tell us that story.
I was in Cairns, that job with Larry, and occasionally we'd be stand away as a pair, I suppose, to give each other support and backup. So we'd met a target accidentally. So again, we'd be given a list of targets to try and get close to or work on, and we'd meet them in pubs or play pool and start conversations, or however we did it. Or sometimes we had an informant to introduce us.
This is the psychopath that you talk about. And you didn't have Google back then, or you didn't have the resources, so you couldn't do a background check on this bloke.
Yeah, you're right.
Sorry, but keep going.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly right. And it found out, we'll just jump ahead a bit, we found out at the end of the operation that he was an escaped double murderer from Yatala Prison in South Australia. At the time, he and I were getting on fabulously. And we bought drugs from him. And that's the thing, you form these false relationships. And even though he was someone I would never associate with in my wildest dreams, normally, you just do. And so we'd go out and have beers and we'd laugh together and we'd smoke some dope and he'd sell us drugs and all of that stuff. So within a nightclub in Cairns, and the nightclub
Right.
I'd been to once before, I think. So anyway, we're in there, decided to go out, took the target out with us, we're all standing at the bar. And the barman came over and I recognised him immediately. It was someone that I hadn't seen since year 9 when I went to school in Cairns High.
Yeah.
And I was a pretty shy little kid, had the short back and sides and the Brill cream and I was a bit chubby and insecure and all of that. And I thought, hell, I'll never know who I am. And I'd grown my hair and I had grown a beard for this operation again. And he walked up and looked at me and said, "Hey, Keith." And I wasn't using the name Keith. I was using the name Jim. So, and in that split second, and people have said to me, have you worried about having your cover blown by crooks, by police? Yeah, you do. But by far the biggest threat is people who know you, either family or relatives or mates. They're the ones that will just automatically go, "Hey, how you going?" So I just used a bit of salty language back at him and told him he had the wrong bloke and so on. And just, get me my effing drinks and, piss off and leave us alone. And I remember turning and looking to the target, and he was looking at me with what I can only describe as Charles Manson eyes, just those dead, black, soulless, evil eyes. And I found out later why that was. He was a psychopathic murderer. And I just thought, and for some reason it just chilled me to the bone. And I thought, "Wolf, And he said, he called you Keith." I said, "He's an idiot. Don't worry about him." So then the rest of the night was, a few drinks, bit of a chat, but the environment had changed. And he kept looking at me and I'm thinking, Jesus.
Yeah. He was as cunning as a shithouse.
Yeah, absolutely. Very affable guy.
Shithouse rat.
Apart from the whole homicide thing.
Yeah. But you could see him turn and his eyes go evil black.
He was right on to me. So the only thing I could do is I went back into the club the next afternoon and asked to speak to the manager, who was Brett. And I told him exactly what I was up to and what had happened. Not knowing this guy was a murderer at that stage, I just thought he was a major drug dealer. And I said, "So, mate, I want to bring him back in, but I want you to play along with me." So we went back in maybe 2 nights later. And Brett came over and apologized profusely. "So I'm so sorry, you look like a guy I went to school with. I'm completely wrong, blah, blah, blah." Made a big deal of it and gave us free drinks all night. And then that fed the ego of this target. And he just turned back to being, okay. Because the cover that Larry and I were using was not that I was a drug dealer, that I was a journalist, a freelance journo. And Larry was my photographer. And we were up there doing a piece on the emerging tourist scene around the Cairns, Kuranda, which it was in those days. And my story was that I'd inherited, $100,000 or something. And I was too lazy to work to make it legitimate. I wanted to turn the money around quickly. And that was, like flies to a honeypot, bees to a honeypot with drug dealers. And the irony of that whole conversation is that when the operation closed and it was discovered who he was, he admitted to the investigating detectives that he was planning to kill me for my money. And I was planning to have him arrested for the drugs. So,
Jeez.
And I remember thinking, and I thought we were mates. So.
But it brings me to the next question, because you say that it's your biggest fear, having your cover blown.
Yep.
And you've got to have a plan B.
Yep. And that's the thing about hypervigilance. You become incredibly hypervigilant. You're always thinking 3 moves ahead. And that's a talent or skill, I suppose, or a habit that stays with you for the rest of your life. You're always thinking 3 moves ahead. So something as silly as, if I'm driving in traffic these days and I'm going over the speed limit, which I tend sometimes to do, let's be honest, I'll have an excuse in my mind already. If the cops stop me, I've got an excuse, even though it's not necessary. Or something will happen in a work environment. I've got an excuse. It's a bizarre habit to have. But in an undercover world, it can be life-saving.
Of course. But you said a little while ago that there was no training. So how did you train? How did you learn? Were you able to talk to other undercover cops with more experience and learn from them? Or did you all sort of feed off each other, swap stories, swap anecdotes? This is what's happened. How would you have handled it? Is that the training you had?
Yeah, that was it. That's exactly it. So there were at that stage, I think, 5 of us, and we were all around, 22 to 25, maybe. I think the oldest might have been almost 25 and a half.
Kids.
Yeah, we were kids, yeah. And when we were able to get together, so, whoever, often we're on operations outside the Brisbane area, so the Gold Coast, Cairns, Mount Isa, over the border sometimes when we weren't supposed to be. Whenever we could get together, we would, and we'd sit in somebody's unit and we'd have a drink or we'd roll a joint and then we'd role play and we'd just go, okay, this happened to me, right? Now, what would you do? And we learnt from each other, really.
Yeah.
And we developed a real bond and this brotherhood that was completely different to any other police camaraderie that you'd expect. We really had a brotherhood and we trusted each other implicitly. They were the only other people I trusted, actually, in those days.
Keith Banks is with me, author, and was in another life an undercover cop, pinching baddies, mostly drug dealers. And I want to get on to mental health in just a second, but please, if you could indulge me, tell me the story about the Vietnam vet and the Jellic night.
Much later in my career. I finished Undercover. I'd gone to the Criminal Investigation Branch. Then I went to Special Weapons or Tactical Response, Tactical Operations in New South Wales. Did all of that, and then I transferred back to the Major Crime Squad. And in the Major Crime Squad, I was running a couple of undercover operations. And so I'd been out on a Saturday, and this is a great story about the unpredictability of policing. I'd been out on a Saturday morning to meet a covert operative that I'd been controlling, got the exhibits, did some debriefing, etc., and making our way back into police headquarters to knock off. So I think it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, somewhere around there. And my colleague and I were in a plain car, and I dressed down. Every excuse I could, I wouldn't wear a tie. So, I was meeting an undercover guy, so I'm wearing jeans and a polo shirt, and I was a bit rebellious. My hair was always longer than it should have been. And we had an any unit call, any unit respond to shots fired in the centre of the city. So, as you do, we raced in there. I jumped out of the car and took some tactical control. That had been my background, so formed it in a cordon, moved the media out of the way and whatever, and ran up the stairs. And there were a few police in the foyer of the MLC building, which in those days was a bit of a landmark in Brisbane. And I can't remember how many. There might have been half a dozen cops inside, some outside, etc. And there was a uniformed sergeant, and as I ran up, gun in hand, I said, right, where is this prick? And he sort of just looked at me and indicated around the corner and said, she's just around there. I had an immediate thought when I was responding about the Hoddle Street massacre in Melbourne, where people had been murdered.
Yes.
The Strathfield massacre in Sydney, Queen Street massacre in Melbourne. And again, long before, these all happened before firearm regulation. So my first thought was, shit, we've got shots fired in this building. There's going to be a potential massacre. I'll go in, and if I have to, I'm going to engage him and kill him. Because I'd been in a gun battle a few years before, and in my tactical world, I'd sort of, been trained very highly. So raced in there, popped around the corner to have a look, and this guy was sitting there with a rifle across his lap and a cardboard box and army webbing. I just did a quick sneak and peek and, took a bead and then drew back again and just started talking, as you do. I'd seen negotiators work. I wasn't a trained negotiator, but I knew how they worked. And he just said, put the effing gun down or I'll blow the whole place up. So for whatever reason, something I vowed I'd never do, I handed my firearm to the uniformed guy and took a couple of steps in and then spent an hour and a half talking to this fellow. And his story was that he was a Vietnam veteran. He'd come back from Vietnam and, like many of them, lost his marriage, went from job to job, had a drinking problem, met someone else, had a child with her, and he had gone into the MLC office, which was an insurance company and superannuation company, and he'd asked to cash his superannuation in because he was falling behind with child support payments. And again, he used some pretty Anglo-Saxon language to describe the guy, but he said this guy just laughed at him and said, if you cash in whatever you've got, you'll have to pay us fees and you'll be left, you'll owe us money.
All right, you know me. I am definitely not one for rabbit food, but these new Power Bee Bite Bars from Nature Bee, they are the real deal. Crunchy chocolate caramel, peanut, honey, choc chip, proper flavours, real flavours. And here's the kicker. Each one's got 5 grams of protein plus Nature Bee's famous Power Pollen to give you that natural lift. And they're just $14.95 a box. Perfect when you're on the go, between meals or need a pick-me-up on the road. It's a snack that actually fuels you, not just fills you. I chuck one in with my Power Pollen capsules in the morning, and I'm sorted for the day. You can grab a 6-month supply of Power Pollen for just $160, and they'll throw in an extra month and 2 bars of their famous pollen and honey soap for free. So if you want to level up your wellness routine, grab a box of Power Bee Bite Bars with your next order of Power Pollen. The links are in the description right now.
And laughed at him. That was the point. Frank was a bit, he was overweight. He had a long black beard. He looked unkempt. He went home to where he was living, went out and got on the gas that night, handed his dog tags to a barmaid that he knew, and then came home and dug up 15 and a half sticks of gelignite and made an IED, so
Jesus.
a bomb. Then he jumped on a trail bike, strapped a rifle across his back and his army webbing, which I found out later contained a hand grenade, and rode into the MLC building, fired shots, and to get the security guard out, and intended to blow the place up. So, I sat with him and eventually talked him out of it all. But the thing that struck me was, at that stage, I was going through what I know now as PTSD. And it's called a disorder. It's an injury, but it becomes a disorder when it affects your life for more than 2 months. I'd been struggling with this for 6 years. So, and as I was talking to him, trying to find some common ground, and it's a bit of a long story, Luke, and shameless marketing plug, people can read about it in my book.
Read about it in the book.
I mean, there was some funny stuff that happened, as you know, but it was really about trying to say anything I could to him to make him feel wanted and to create a bond between the two of us. A lot of, and I'm not saying he's psychopathic, quite far from it. He was damaged, poor bugger. But, often you will see victims of crime, if they can form a relationship with their predator, they're less likely to be killed because the predator sees them as being human, not just a target. What I was trying to do with Frank was form a bond so that he could see that it was he and I against the rest of the world. And I just made it up as I went along, believe me. But as we were talking, and he started to tell me about his Vietnam service and what had happened, he was what was called an assault pioneer. So those guys in combat are the ones who are trained to blow up bridges, to go down tunnels, to blow things up. And so he knew what he was doing. And I'd been bomb trained. So I was a qualified bomb technician by that stage. And I looked at what he had in this cardboard carton, and there were 15 sticks of gelignite.
Wow.
All wired with 3 electronic detonators to a 12-volt battery, which it was a goer.
Jeez.
And when I say 15 and a half sticks, when I first started talking to him, I said, "So what do you got in the carton, mate?" And he pulled a half a stick out and tossed it to me, and I fortunately caught it. And it was some sweating gelignite through the wrapper, so unstable gelignite, which meant that potentially,
God.
I tossed it to me.
He threw it at you.
And potentially, if you dropped it on the floor, it could have exploded. So there we were, and again, the unpredictability of police work. I was on my way back to the office, and here I am sitting with a guy who had the opportunity, I have the means, and the opportunity to kill both of us as soon as it crossed his mind. So talked him into handing me the rifle, talked him into, potentially leaving with me, and we went through what he was going through. And he talked about nightmares, he talked about drinking, he talked about the anger that he felt, and he was going up and down all the time. And I remember thinking, Jesus, this is what I'm feeling. Because you said it at the beginning of the interview, PTSD was unheard of in those days. And I thought I was struggling by myself. I just thought after a gun battle I'd been in where a friend of mine was killed, I went through all of this, and I just thought, I knew I had some problems, but I just thought it was me, not understanding or knowing that it's so bloody common. And as Frank was telling me everything, I had this realization of, shit, that's what I'm feeling. So we got to the stage where I was about, I thought I had him and we were going to leave, and then he pulled the hand grenade out and removed the pin and said, "That's it, I'm just going to detonate this, get out." And I knew that if I'd even been able to run out of where I was, the hand grenade fuse is around 3 to 5 seconds. So had that thing gone off, it would have sympathetically detonated the entire device, which meant I was going to die anyway. So I just looked him in the eye and said, "Mate, I've got enough nightmares and I'm not going to let you be another one." And after, I don't know, seemed like an hour, it was probably more 30 seconds, he put the pin back in and handed me the grenade, and I was able to talk him out after that.
Wow. I totally relate to what you're saying. And this is about you, not about me, but just for your information, I'm an ambassador for
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm
a
aware of it.
charity
Yeah.
called Wounded Heroes,
Yep.
Martin Shaw. And we look after vets who have come back with problems between their ears. And we have some Vietnam vets actually on our books that we look after, but it just never ceases to amaze me. Basically, we try and give financial and psychiatric help and whatever help is needed to men and women who have served overseas and have come back without any support. It also, I found out through my association with Wounded Heroes, that being in the ADF, it's the only job, government or non-government, where you don't get work cover. So I totally relate to what you're saying. I wonder, interesting, because you said when you were going to the MLC Centre, you were prepared to run up the stairs and kill this bloke if needed. And I often wonder, and I hope that wonderful police officer, Amy Scott, who killed the Bondi stabber. I don't even want to, John Gauchi was his name, but I don't even want to mention the prick's name. But Amy Scott, who was in Bondi doing bar regulatory work, looking for underage drinkers, responsible service of alcohol, just on a routine check, she's called into the Westfield and her life changed forever. And incredibly brave. She's saved, I don't know how many people, but you do worry that people like Amy Scott are getting the help that she needs. I don't know her. I don't know if she needs the help, but wow. I mean, fancy having a job where you leave for work in the morning and you might not come home.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've got a recent event of a senior connie in Tasmania being shot and killed when he was out serving a warrant, a normal warrant, the course of events. And Amy did a fantastic job. That ironically, well, not ironically, maybe the wrong word, but the very next day, a Queensland police officer shot and killed a knife wielding offender as well. And Amy's incredible act was given massive coverage, as well it should be. And yet this other person did the same thing the next day, and it was almost verging on criticism in the media.
Yep.
And I think the media have a hell of a lot of responsibility for the narrative that is painted on these situations. If Amy had confronted an offender armed with an edged weapon, and there hadn't been the Westfield deaths and stabbings, it is likely the media may have made some comment like, why wasn't he shot in the leg? Why didn't she have a taser? Was it necessary? But because it was clearly in the public eye, the narrative is different, and so it bloody should be. But you have a lot of police who confront people with edged weapons and shoot and kill them, and they're almost judged in the media. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the detective that tasered the elderly woman in Cooma didn't help.
Oh, that was, I can't make comment on that. I do. But I'm more about edged weapons, mate. I'm more about, the fact that someone armed with a knife can take you out very, very quickly.
Okay, let me ask you this then. I am digressing, but I've got you here. So one of the people killed that terrible day was a security guard from Pakistan who'd only just started the job, wasn't trained, wasn't ready for this. Should security guards be better trained? Should they be able to carry non-lethal weapons, a baton, pepper spray, a taser, and should they be wearing knife-proof or bulletproof vests? Had that security guard been able to drop that bloke with a taser or with pepper spray, how many lives would have been saved, I wonder? I'm just putting it out there because you're an expert.
That's a really good question. I do some consultancy now in the risk area, and I do work for a couple of clients in that field. I made a recommendation recently for stab-proof vests to be issued to security officers in a particular area.
Okay.
But now the thing is, stab-proof vest, absolutely. I would, in my view, anybody's providing security anywhere now, they should, as a minimum, have a stab resistance. Nothing to have a stab-proof, a stab-resistant vest. Now, the issue of batons, tasers...
Non-lethal weapons.
Non-lethal,
Non-lethal weapons. Should security guards have them?
It depends completely on where they're deployed, I would think. Now, also, a taser doesn't work every time. A taser is not 100% effective. Neither is spray. I've sprayed people in a tactical situation, and I'm talking sieges and high-risk raids, that has had no effect on them.
But it's better than having nothing, isn't
It's
it?
better, yeah, true. I mean, there's a whole conversation going on now about, I think in Western Australia, the issue or the supply of pepper spray to civilians is being legalised. So it's a whole other Pandora's box.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Look, I think from a risk perspective, a security officer should be equipped with anything that makes their workplace safe.
Chubb's security guards have guns. But,
yeah.
but there's an argument there that also makes them a target for crooks who want to steal their guns.
Yeah, which happened a lot. Yeah, back in the old days of armoured car robberies, often what would happen is that the firearms would be stolen and then they're in the possession of crooks. Yeah, the whole thing about armed security officers is a different conversation. You know, you really have to be highly trained in the use of firearms, I think. And from personal experience, pointing and squeezing the trigger and shooting a human being is not as easy as it seems to be, or it could potentially be. You know, it's one of the hardest things that you can do in life. So from a non-lethal perspective, yeah, I think you will see now that there would be risk assessments being conducted across Westfields and across retail areas with that consideration in mind.
It's a debate worth having.
It is.
And because I don't know whether you know this, but one of my former employers was John Singleton.
No, I didn't. No.
When I worked at 2GB.
Yep.
And
of course.
Tragically, it was his daughter, Dawn, was one of those getting ready for her wedding. And Singo was vehemently against the inquiry into all of this. And I am being respectful, but I disagree with Singo on this because there had to be an inquiry to try and make sure this doesn't happen again.
Oh, that's the purpose of an inquest, mate. You can't not have an inquest into a situation like that. And inquest is not about blame placing. An inquest is about looking at what occurred and, as you say, putting in measures to do the best you can to ensure it doesn't happen again. You never eliminate risk, but you can certainly minimise it. So I think it's a question that needs to be debated, discussed, and I think it needs to be discussed from an expert's opinion perspective and not, you know, a lot of people jump on these bandwagons who have no knowledge about the area. But for me, if I'm providing personnel, I don't, but if I were providing personnel to an area where they were required to undertake security duties, I would want to make sure they were equipped. For that to happen, I think there needs to be a legislative change for it to occur. I think from memory, security officers are only allowed to carry non-lethals if they're in a particular area and that's governed by legislation. So there's a whole raft of conversation that has to happen around it.
You know, since Port Arthur and the gun legislation, John Howard's gun legislation, at the moment, and we've seen recently, and look, it's before courts, it does involve a juvenile. We may never know who they are, but there was a stabbing at a party at a house recently, but knife crime in Sydney and Melbourne is just rife. Should police officers have the power to search somebody and see if they've actually got a knife concealed without a decent reason? One of the arguments against it is, they could be profiling people from a certain ethnical background or an age group or someone who wears a certain style of clothing. I think if you've got any reasonable doubt, you should be able to search someone for a weapon. What do you think? Because the civil libertarians are up in arms about this.
Very quick and concise answer, yes.
Thank you.
Police do not have enough powers to search. And you're right, there is so much risk aversion by those in command of policing now that they're too concerned about criticism. Now, for me, if the knife crime is out of control in Melbourne, I live in Melbourne these days, it is out of control. The police don't have sufficient power. They need the power to do it, because then it becomes a situation that's similar to the broken shutter theory in New York City.
New York City, yeah. Giuliani. It becomes a situation where if you're carrying a weapon in public and you know the cops can stop you at any time, maybe you'll rethink it. At the moment, juvenile criminals and adult offenders know that the police have very little power, so they flaunt it. Then you've got to combine that with the bail laws and action and consequence. It's another whole thing we could spend an hour discussing. But yeah, I don't think police powers are sufficient at all. I had an amazing conversation with Mark Ainsworth about juvenile crime, and maybe on another date, if you want to come back and do another chat with me, maybe I can have you and Mark on at the same time. We can talk about juvenile crime and your thoughts on it. Maybe we
Sure. Yeah.
Can we do that down the track?
Yeah. I know Mark. So, yep.
Yeah. I want to get back to your advocacy for dealing with PTSD. We mentioned Vietnam vets and I mentioned wounded heroes. Your expertise is with the police force, and I mentioned, first responders that must have terrible trouble getting to sleep when they've seen horrific things that ordinary people like me wouldn't even want to dream about. How do we go about addressing this? I remember my pop, this is my grandfather, he survived World War I, Villers-Bretonneux, survived,
Wow.
was blown up. His whole battalion was blown up, 6 people survived, and they called themselves the Fragments because they had shrapnel all through them. But he came back a broken man and would wake up in the middle of the night, Mum tells me, screaming and yelling and just a broken man. And back then everyone said, shell shock. And that was it.
Yeah.
It's toughen up.
Yep.
Have a spoon of cement and toughen up. That doesn't cut it anymore. It needs to be addressed. This is my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Look, there's a whole, gee whiz, this is a whole conversation again, Luke. There is an epidemic, an unrecorded epidemic of suicides amongst particularly former police across this country. And the data is not captured. If you're ADF and you resign from the army or retire and you commit suicide, then it's captured in a data set. That's why the ADF commission, the Royal Commission into Defence Deaths had such traction. I know right off the top of my head, 6 of my friends who committed suicide after they left the police over the last 12 years. And it's not, that's just my cohort. It's not captured anywhere. And there needs to be a commission of inquiry into law enforcement or police suicides, both current and former, but also that needs to be expanded to paramedics and fireys. Now, I have done work with Fire Rescue Victoria here, or I'm about to do some more work with them later in the year. And I talk about my journey through post-traumatic stress disorder, the organizational errors and mistakes, and how you can prepare your mental fitness and your emotional resilience. And you're not born with resilience. Resilience is like you almost have to be broken in order to develop resilience.
Yes.
That's what happens in life.
Yes.
And on the counter of it, people will claim that they're all stressed and they have trauma and blah, blah, blah. And sometimes that's just Tuesday in the real world. But those who do struggle with ongoing trauma, whether it be individual or vicarious, there needs to be unquestioned support.
Yep.
So let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say a police service, force, department, I quite like the word force, but I'm old-fashioned. So a police force has a support system in place for you, Luke, as a police officer. You've gone through some shit and you're struggling and they go, okay, Luke, you can come forward and you can put your hand up and we'll give you help. The reality is you won't do it. And you won't do it because there's still an unspoken attitude that, this guy, Luke, so say, for instance, you apply for a promotional panel and you sit before the panel, you answer all the questions, you're the candidate. When you leave the room, they'll go, that bloke, he's got some dramas. What do you mean?
He's a bit soft.
He put his hand up for mental health support.
He's a bit fragile and he's a bit soft, yeah.
Or he's got a bit of mental health troubles, and that still happens. So what that means is that the average cop goes outside and they seek their own support. They pay for it themselves and they don't go through work cover.
Or worse, they self-medicate.
Or worst case scenario, it all gets too much for them and they go and sign their fire out and kill themselves. Now, if you look at a number of police suicides, and this is a raw conversation to have, a number of police suicides, particularly over the last decade, have occurred at work. And the reason cops kill themselves at work is they want to make a statement. They know that their mates are going to have to come and find them, and that's horrible, but they kill themselves in the office because they just can't face it anymore, rather than do it at home, rather than do it somewhere else. And that both saddens me and alarms me because I don't see things progressing as quickly as they should. The Americans do it really well. The Yanks wrap their arms around cops who are struggling. They wrap their arms around them and they look after them. We still have that bloody Australian attitude of, well, even though we don't say it anymore, but I'm going to give you an example in a minute and I'll be very careful how I say it because I don't want the person identified. But there's still that attitude about, hey, this is the job. Toughen up, mate. I had a visit to the Fire Rescue Academy a couple of weeks ago in Melbourne. They are completely the opposite. And it really warmed my heart to watch how genuine they are about the welfare of their fireys. Because the fireys, and particularly in the rescue component, are dragging people out of cars and beheaded, decapitated people and so on. They really, really look after them. A situation occurred in this country, and I'm going to be very careful how I say it. A situation occurred in this country that was horrible from a police law enforcement perspective. One of those involved, who was incredibly traumatized, was told, quote unquote, you need to get over this and move on. Now, and I'm not saying anything's going to identify it, as I keep saying, but it was horrible. And for that comment to be made to an operational cop is abysmal. The impact on that person's mental health and recovery is insurmountable, almost insurmountable. That person has a lot more resilience than people have given them credit for. And I'm speaking in riddles, but
Yep.
you know, and often in my experience, these comments are made by people who've never seen an angry man, as we used to call it. In other words, have probably not been on the road and not been operational, not being confronted by life-threatening events. And it's easy for them to sit in an office environment where they've been promoted to a certain rank, well beyond their ability, the old Peter principle, and make these comments. Or they can be the type that I mentioned earlier in the interview, the old style detective who used to, you know, like, I don't know, Bluey, and drink a lot of beers and talk about how good they were, and then condemn others for a reaction. So that attitude the culture has to change from the top, and it has to be jumped all over.
So I've worked with, alongside with, and spoken on this podcast to a mate of mine, Gus Warland, who looks after Gotcha for Life. And there are plenty of agencies out there, but it's just making that initial contact to say, I need help. I'm not coping. And you just said it a little while ago. It's making that first step and admitting that you're struggling a bit, you need some help, and worried sick that you're going to be judged.
Yeah, I think, you know what the answer is, mate? The answer is to have people like me or others or whoever, not necessarily me, but people talking to recruit classes at the academy and saying, okay, this is what this job may entail. If it does, this is what has worked for me, or this is what I think you should consider. And have that cultural change about an openness and discussion about mental health from day one. I had coffee with a young cop, he's 25, here in Victoria last year. He'd read my book or something, that doesn't matter. But anyway, he contacted me through social media. You know, I'd love to have a copy with you and meet you. And I said, sure. So I had a copy with him. Impressive young man. And he'd been in the job, I think, for 3 years and had been in 4 critical incidents already. And critical incidents are life-threatening. One of the first questions I ask is, how are you? How's it going for you? How are you feeling? And he said, mate, I surf. He said, so I'll have a shit day at work. I'll jump in the car, I'll drive to a beach and I'll surf. When I come out, if I don't feel cleansed emotionally, I'll go back in again. And I said, that is gold, because you're already identifying what you can do from an exercise or a mindfulness perspective to release some serotonin and to take your mind off that and just, you know, you don't have to sit in an orange robe and look at the sunrise and chant to be mindful. You know, and I said, what you're doing is gold, mate. I can't give you any advice. God, I wish, you know, you'd given me that advice if the situation were reversed.
He sounds like a very old 25-year-old, which is great. His parents must be very proud.
His father was in the job. So
there you are.
His dad was in the job, and his dad's told him things that he's learnt through trial and error. Yeah.
Keith, I really desperately want to talk to you again. There's so much to, I got to say, just in recent times, we all here in Australia got to witness firsthand the most unbelievable undercover police work in the inquiry and the final arrest of that monster, Brett Peter Cowan, who murdered Daniel Morecambe. And the way the police gently and carefully coerced him into believing that they were something that they weren't, and finally getting an arrest, that was fascinating. You must have watched that and thought, wow.
Yeah, I did. I just thought that was brilliant. I can't remember the name of the Australian movie that was influenced by that job, but it's called The Stranger, I think. I'm not sure. But the portrayal of the undercover is brilliant in that. It's just, I looked at that and thought, wow. Joel Edgerton plays the part of the undercover cop, and he does it magnificently. That whole job was testament to the use of undercover techniques where traditional methods fail. And covert policing now has come leaps and bounds from when I was doing it. And you're right, mate. I looked at it, I researched it,
I bet you did. I bet you did.
And I'm fortunate enough to still be in a network where I can talk to people and get some feedback about things that the average person doesn't hear. You get my drift? Yeah, I spoke to people about it and just, wow, it's something I would have loved to have been involved in some way, shape or form.
But you've got to be a NIDA on steroids actor. Because if you blow it, you've blown it. The movie was called The Stranger, right, 2022, Joel Edgerton. You're spot on, and Sean Harris. Well done.
Thanks. Yeah, it's made I'd love to meet Joel one of these days because I'd like to shake his hand because he portrayed that fantastically. And, the undercovers are the unsung heroes of that operation because we'll never know their names, as it should be.
Yeah, yeah. They used to give you up, didn't they, when you had to give evidence?
Yeah.
Didn't they give you up?
Yeah, after every operation in my day, your identity was disclosed, your real name, not
how
an assumed
stupid was
one.
that?
Oh, Wild West days.
That is the name of your next book.
The Wild West.
I want a credit on the back sleeve.
I'll get back to you.
Yeah, get your people, we'll talk to my people.
I think the next book, Luke, will be about other people's stories.
Yeah.
I want to write about the unsung heroes in this.
You're an excellent writer.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
And
thank you.
Yeah, you're a great communicator. I've already felt like I knew you before we started this chat, and I've got to say, I'd love to talk to you again if we could.
Oh, I'd love to, yeah, for sure.
What's your message for the day?
And my message for the day is twofold. Next time you see a police car, don't automatically think they're writing a traffic ticket. Try to have some understanding of the fact that they may have just come from a tragedy. They may have experienced something that you never will. And they are the line between us and chaos, so have a little bit of respect for the cops. The second thing is, if you personally are struggling, you don't need to be in a gunfight to have trauma. You don't need to have been a first responder to have trauma. If you're personally struggling, find someone you trust and ask them if you can have 5 minutes of their time and be honest and vulnerable with them. If you're the person that someone comes to, give them 5 minutes of your time and then shut up and don't try to solve their problems. Just be somewhere they can listen to. And that's where it all starts. Yeah, that's a way to healing.
Keith Banks, you've got to read the books, Drugs, Guns and Lies, and Gun to the Head, with more to come. They're screaming out for a screenplay. Maybe Joel Edgerton can play you, hey?
Well, I tell you what, if the options are open, so, let's use your massive network and grab Joel and tell him to have a talk to me.
Done. My network, it's the producer of this podcast, Kelsey the Millennial. We'll find him. We'll get you two kids together.
That would be awesome. That would be awesome.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's a really easy conversation to have with you, Luke. And yeah, mate, I feel like I know you very well now, so thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, mate. Need a post-show pick-me-up? I know what I'm grabbing. Nature Bee's new Power Bee Bite Bars, packed with protein, boosted with pollen, and they're bloody tasty too. And they're just $14.95 a box. Pair them with your Power Pollen capsules. You're going to thank me later. You can grab a 6-month supply of Power Pollen for just $160, and they'll throw in an extra month and 2 bars of their famous pollen and honey soap for free. Nature Bee's got everything you need to keep energized all day, every day. Do not wait. The ultimate wellness routine is just a click away. Head to the description now.